Most people think emotional identity is just another name for personality. They assume that if they are naturally intense, naturally withdrawn, naturally tender, naturally restless, then those patterns belong to temperament and stop there. But emotional identity goes deeper than temperament because temperament describes how you appear, while emotional identity describes what keeps repeating underneath your appearance. It is the emotional shape your being tends to form, even when circumstances, roles, and environments change. You may change your language, your beliefs, your habits, even your social mask, yet still notice that the same kinds of emotional climates keep finding you, because something in you is not just reacting to life, but organizing experiences through a deeper signature. That is why certain emotional patterns feel older than the current life that carries them. A person can have no obvious reason for chronic guilt, for recurring loneliness, for disproportionate protectiveness, for unusual grief, or for a tenderness that appears before trust has been established. Modern language usually rushes to explain these through biography alone. Biography matters, but it does not explain everything. Sometimes life events activate the pattern, but they do not create it, they reveal it. The same way weather reveals the shape of a landscape that was already there. You may notice this most clearly when you compare emotional reaction to emotional tendency. Reaction changes quickly, tendency remains. Reaction belongs to the immediate event, but tendency keeps surfacing across unrelated situations. One person feels abandoned in friendship, in work, in love, and even in spiritual practice, not because every environment is identical, but because the emotional field through which life is being received already carries a certain imprint. Another person keeps becoming the stabilizer in every room, the emotional anchor, the one who absorbs, translates, steadies, and contains. That repetition is not random. It is identity functioning emotionally before identity has been consciously understood. This is where the idea becomes more demanding than people expect, because once you understand emotional identity this way, you can no longer reduce your recurring feelings to mere bad habits or personal flaws. Some of what you have been calling your weakness may actually be a deep signature moving through distorted conditions. Some of what you have been calling maturity may simply be a polished survival response that aligned well enough with your environment to avoid criticism. Emotional identity does not flatter you. It does not accuse you either. It simply reveals that your inner life has a recognizable architecture, and that architecture influences what you notice, what you fear, what you cling to, what you trust, and what kind of emotional weather feels strangely familiar even when it hurts. A useful way to see this is to ask what emotion becomes easiest for you to organize your life around. Not what emotion you feel most dramatically, but what emotion seems to create the most stable version of yourself. Some people become coherent around sorrow. They know who they are when they are carrying pain, and they feel almost shapeless when peace arrives. Some become coherent around longing. They know how to move when something remains just out of reach, and fulfillment unsettles them more than frustration. Others become coherent around vigilance, around tenderness, around yearning, around restraint, around ache. Emotional identity is often hidden inside the feeling that gives a person a strange sense of continuity. That continuity can be mistaken for destiny, and that is where confusion begins. Just because an emotional signature runs deep does not mean it is meant to rule you forever. Signature is not a prison. It is more like a primary tone that can be distorted, refined, amplified, or integrated. This matters because many people hear an idea like this and immediately either romanticize their pain or condemn it. They say, "This is just who I am," or they say, "I have to get rid of this to become who I am supposed to be." Both responses miss the point. The work is not to worship the signature or to erase it. The work is to understand what it becomes when it is unconscious, what it becomes when it is wounded, and what it becomes when it is finally brought into truthful relationship with the rest of the self. You can see this clearly in the difference between emotional signature and emotional distortion. A person whose deep signature is tenderness may become overgiving, porous, or unable to separate compassion from self erasure. Another person with the same signature may become a profound healer or relational space, someone whose sensitivity remains intact without turning into collapse. The root tone can be similar while the expression changes dramatically. This means emotional identity is not a verdict, it is a field of possibility. What you are emotionally shaped by is not the same thing as what you are emotionally doomed to repeat. This also explains why certain emotional lessons seem to follow people across decades. They are not just repeating because the person refuses to learn. Sometimes they are repeating because the deeper identity tone has not yet been understood well enough to evolve its form. A person with an emotional signature around invisibility may keep entering spaces where they feel overlooked, not because the world is singularly cruel, but because the unresolved signature keeps recruiting circumstances that allow it to remain legible. Once understood, that same tone might become an unusual capacity for perceiving what everyone else misses, for listening beneath performance, for noticing the hidden life in others. But before that evolution, it simply feels like exclusion happening again and again. This is where the idea begins to shift from explanation into responsibility. If emotional identity helps organize perception, then every major emotional pattern in your life becomes something more serious than a mood. It becomes part of the lens through which reality is being interpreted. Two people can enter the same room and leave with entirely different emotional truths, not because one is lying, but because their emotional identities are selecting different signals for survival and meaning. One feels threat where another feels invitation. One feels distance where another feels spaciousness. One feels burden where another feels purpose. Emotional identity does not create all reality, but it powerfully influences which layer of reality becomes available to you. Once that becomes visible, a second question appears. If some emotional patterns follow the soul across time, how do they keep their continuity while personality changes so much from life to life? The answer is not that the same exact feelings repeat in the same exact form. The answer is that the deeper orientation remains while the surface expression adapts. The same root tone can wear many costumes. A signature of abandonment in one life may appear as hyper independence in another. A signature of devotion may appear in one life as loyalty and in another as spiritual hunger. The forms shift, but the organizing emotional gravity remains recognizably similar. This is why some emotional experiences feel instantly ancient. You may meet a person and feel protective before there is any personal history. You may enter a place and feel grief before anything visible has happened. You may hear certain truths and feel the strange pain of recognition rather than new discovery. Emotional identity often speaks through immediacy. It knows before the thinking mind knows. It reacts before the personal story can catch up. That does not mean every intense emotion is sacred or correct, but it does mean some feelings are carriers of memory deeper than ordinary recall. And yet, this teaching becomes dangerous if it is used carelessly. The moment someone hears that emotional patterns may follow the soul, there is a temptation to use that idea to make every feeling feel ultimate. That is not wisdom. Emotional identity is not a license to obey every strong current. In fact, the stronger the signature, the more discipline it requires. Deep patterns feel convincing precisely because they are old. They feel true because they are familiar. But familiarity can preserve distortion as easily as it preserves wisdom. Soul's deeper emotional tone must still be tested by contact, by consequence, by relational truth, and by what it becomes when not driven by fear. A person begins maturing in this area when they can say something very precise. They can say, "This feeling belongs to my deep pattern, but this reaction belongs to my current wound." That distinction changes everything. It prevents emotional identity from being flattened into self diagnosis, and it prevents healing from becoming self erasure. It allows someone to honor what runs deep in them without letting the oldest part of them control every present moment. This is a quieter kind of mastery than most people look for, but it is real. It is the ability to recognize your emotional signature without collapsing your whole identity into it. You can watch this happen in ordinary life in ways that are almost easy to miss. Someone who has always carried the tone of longing stops chasing unavailable people and begins discovering that longing itself contains perception, devotion, and depth that do not require deprivation to stay alive. Someone who has always carried the tone of sorrow stops organizing intimacy around pain and discovers that sorrow can become reverence rather than heaviness. Someone who has always carried vigilance learns that their sensitivity to danger can evolve into discernment rather than anxiety. The emotional identity does not vanish, it becomes more truthful. This is one reason emotional growth often feels less like becoming someone else and more like recovering the clean version of something ancient. People assume healing means removing the old pattern entirely. Often it means separating the pattern from the survival structures wrapped around it. Underneath possessiveness, there may have been devotion. Underneath numbness, there may have been restraint. Underneath collapse, there may have been sincerity too overwhelmed to remain formed. Emotional identity is refined when the false protections fall away and the deeper tone no longer has to speak through distortion to remain visible. That refinement changes how memory itself begins to make sense. You start to notice that certain important moments in life were not random emotional events, but activations of the deeper pattern. Some relationships hit so hard because they lit up your emotional identity, not just your preferences. Some losses broke open more than grief because they touched the signature layer beneath personality. Some spiritual recognitions shook you because they did not arrive as ideas first. They arrived as emotional truth, as if something in you had been waiting to be named in exactly that frequency. Once you see this, your life history starts to arrange itself differently. The emotional thread becomes visible beneath the events, and that thread is where the teaching keeps widening. Because if emotional identity shapes perception, relationship, and memory, then it also shapes path. It influences what kind of teachings reach you, what kind of people you recognize, what kind of pain you cannot ignore, and what kind of service feels natural even before it feels safe. This does not mean emotional identity should become your only map. It means it may be one of the oldest maps already operating in you. The question is not whether it exists. The question is whether you will continue living inside it unconsciously or begin learning the difference between the version of it that keeps repeating your past and the version of it that may be trying to become your deeper way of moving through truth. You begin to understand emotional identity more fully when you stop treating it as a private feeling pattern and start seeing it as a way your being enters reality. It is not only about what you feel often, it is about what kind of emotional truth your system is built to recognize first, carry longest, and struggle hardest to translate cleanly. One person is shaped to notice fracture before harmony, another to notice longing before fulfillment, another to notice tenderness before danger, another to notice danger before trust. None of those perceptions are neutral. They create different inner maps, and those maps quietly influence the roads a life can imagine taking. This is why two people can hear the same teaching and leave with entirely different realizations. The mind may understand the same words, but emotional identity determines which part of the truth feels immediate. A person whose deeper signature is organized around ache may hear a teaching about love and immediately recognize the cost of losing it. A person whose signature is organized around vigilance may hear the same teaching and immediately recognize the risk of trusting it. The difference is not intelligence, it is emotional orientation. Once you see that, you start to understand that identity is not just what you think yourself to be. It is also what kind of emotional doorway opens first every time reality asks something of you. That doorway becomes especially important in relationships because relationships do not only meet personality, they meet emotional signature. This is why some people feel strangely known by one another before they have even enough ordinary history to justify the feeling. Something deeper is recognizing the other person's field. Sometimes that recognition feels like relief. Sometimes it feels like danger. Sometimes it feels like home and threat at the same time, because the signature being touched is old enough to carry both memory and distortion. A person can believe they are choosing a relationship for obvious reasons, while the deeper pull is coming from emotional identity seeking repetition, completion, or refinement. You can see this mechanism clearly when certain bonds activate emotional intensity out of proportion to the present situation. A brief interaction opens unusual devotion, mistrust, protectiveness, grief, or familiarity. The ordinary explanation is often chemistry, but chemistry is only part of the picture. Emotional identity is involved whenever the present moment seems to awaken a pattern that was already waiting to be named. This does not mean every powerful bond is sacred. It means emotional significance often arrives before rational explanation, and that significance deserves better language than simple attraction or incompatibility. Once you begin looking through that lens, your own life history starts arranging itself differently. You notice that many major turning points were not random emotional events, but encounters with your deeper signature. The jobs you stayed in too long, the people you could not let go of, the teachings that altered you, the losses that changed your internal weather, all begin revealing a thread. At first, this can feel almost too neat, as though life is being oversimplified. But the opposite is true. The thread does not reduce the life, it makes visible the emotional continuity hidden inside its complexity. This emotional continuity is one reason certain forms of healing feel partial even when they genuinely help. You can learn better communication, stronger boundaries, more reflective habits, and still feel that some underlying pattern has only become more manageable, not truly understood. That does not mean the work failed. It means practical healing often stabilizes surface behavior before deeper emotional identity has been brought into view. The person suffers less, which matters, but still does not know why particular emotional climates continue to feel more real than others. Emotional identity asks a deeper question than how do I function better? It asks what emotional pattern has been organizing my sense of self all along. That question becomes even more serious when you notice how emotional identity shapes memory. Not memory in the simple sense of recalling events, but memory in the deeper sense of what a being remains loyal to emotionally, even after the story has changed. A person may no longer consciously identify with abandonment, humiliation, guilt, or responsibility, and yet still organize choices around never feeling that old atmosphere again. Another person may no longer remember the origin of a deep tenderness, but still respond to certain souls, places, or truths with a grief that feels older than the current life. Emotional identity stores continuity, not only through thought, but through emotional recurrence. This is why some emotional patterns are difficult to reason out of existence. They are not being held in place by argument alone. They are being held by an entire internal orientation. The system has learned not just what to think, but what to expect, what to notice, and what to prepare for. This is also why transformation often begins not with replacing a belief, but with surviving a new emotional experience long enough for the deeper orientation to loosen. A person who has always felt identity through rejection does not change only because they hear they are worthy. They begin changing when worthiness becomes emotionally survivable without immediate suspicion. Emotional identity refines through lived contradiction, not just through explanation. And yet, even that is not the whole picture, because emotional identity is not merely individual. Once it begins expressing itself through repeated choices, it starts shaping role. Someone whose emotional signature tends toward burden may repeatedly become the one who carries others. Someone whose signature tends toward invisibility may repeatedly become the quiet observer who sees everything and is rarely fully seen. Someone whose signature tends towards yearning may keep becoming the one who seeks, studies, reaches, and remains slightly beyond arrival. Over time, these recurrent roles begin to look like personality, but they are often emotional identity wearing social form. That social form then feeds back into the signature itself. The person is rewarded for becoming useful in the exact shape their deeper pattern already made easy. The one organized around burden is praised for being dependable. The one organized around yearning is praised for depth. The one organized around vigilance is praised for foresight. None of that praise is false, but it can hide an important confusion. A gift can be real while still being intertwined with an unresolved signature. What people admire in you may be partly the refined edge of your emotional identity and partly the part of you that has learned how to survive through it. This is where the teaching becomes sharper, because many people do not want to know where gift and wound overlap. They want a cleaner answer. They want to know whether a trait is healthy or unhealthy, evolved or unevolved, true or false. Emotional identity rarely gives such clean divisions. It reveals that some of what is most beautiful in a person has grown through struggle without being reducible to struggle. It reveals that some of what is most painful in a person is not proof of brokenness, but evidence of a deeper tone still searching for honest form. Once you see that, compassion becomes more intelligent. It stops excusing distortion, but it also stops mistaking distortion for the whole self. This changes how you understand repetition. Repetition is often treated as failure, as if the return of an emotional pattern proves a lack of growth. Sometimes it does reveal unfinished work, but sometimes repetition is the way a deep signature keeps appearing until it is recognized in its true scale. A pattern may repeat first as pain, then as relationship, then as calling, then as insight. The person thinks the universe is sending the same lessons again, when in reality, the same emotional identity is becoming visible through new levels of consequence. The repetition is not always there to punish. It is often there to reveal a deeper structure the person has not yet learned to read. You may notice this in yourself when an emotion that once seemed like a flaw begins to reveal an entirely different function. What once felt like oversensitivity begins to look like unusual perception. What once felt like excessive grief begins to look like deep memory. What once felt like chronic restlessness begins to look like a soul that was never built for spiritual sleep. This does not mean every difficult emotion is secretly noble. It means that once the emotional identity becomes visible, you can no longer settle for shallow labels. You begin asking not only what this pattern caused, but what it may have been trying to protect, carry, or reveal before it became distorted. That question matters because the future of the pattern depends on how you answer it. If you only condemn the emotional identity, you will try to cut yourself off from something essential. If you only romanticize it, you will keep letting old distortions speak in the language of destiny. The wiser movement is slower. You begin studying the difference between the signature and the defense wrapped around it. You ask what this emotional tendency becomes when fear is removed from it. You ask what it becomes when it is no longer trying to guarantee love, avoid shame, or preserve continuity through pain. That is where deeper refinement starts. At that point, emotional identity stops being just a pattern you notice and becomes a path you must choose how to walk. You realize you are not inheriting an emotional signature. You are participating in its next expression. The longing can become devotion or perpetual dissatisfaction. The sorrow can become reverence or self definition through pain. The vigilance can become discernment or isolation. The tenderness can become presence or self abandonment. The signature gives the feel, but your consciousness helps determine its form. This is why emotional identity eventually leads into a larger spiritual responsibility. It is not enough to know what you feel often. You begin needing to know what in you keeps trying to become itself through those feelings. You begin needing to distinguish between the part that is asking to be understood and the part that is asking to stay familiar. That distinction is subtle, but it changes the whole path. It changes how you love, how you remember, how you choose, and how you interpret the moments in life that seem to touch you more deeply than thought can explain. And once you start seeing emotional identity at that depth, another question begins rising almost on its own. If some emotional patterns are signatures of the deeper self rather than accidents of the current life, then how do those signatures interact with one another when souls meet, separate, wound, teach, or remember each other across time? When emotional identities meet, they do not simply interact at the level of preference. They begin influencing the shape of each other's inner weather. This is why some relationships feel larger than the time they have existed. A short encounter can awaken years of material because it does not only touch personality, It reaches the deeper signature that has been waiting for a particular kind of contact. The result is that a person often thinks they are reacting to the present bond when they are also responding to the activation of an older emotional pattern that has suddenly found a living mirror. That mirror can clarify, distort, intensify, or reorganize the signature depending on the condition of both people involved. If one person carries a deep emotional tone of longing and another carries a deep emotional tone of distance, the relationship may immediately generate a familiar field for both. One feels called to move closer, the other feels called to maintain space. Each may believe the other caused the pattern, but often the deeper truth is that both signatures recognize the structure they already knew how to inhabit. This is one reason emotional identity can make certain bonds feel faded when they may actually be repeating a field that has not yet been understood well enough to evolve. That does not make the bond unreal. It makes it more important to read accurately. A relationship can be deeply significant without being permanently aligned. It can be catalytic without being safe. It can be loving while still pulling both people into old emotional arrangements. Emotional identity does not only explain why people connect, it explains why some forms of connection feel spiritually large while still remaining emotionally unresolved. A person may keep calling the bond sacred because it reached something real, while avoiding the harder question of what exactly it reached and what it is now teaching through that contact. You begin to see this more clearly when you stop asking only what another person makes you feel and start asking what in you becomes more available in their presence. Some people awaken your ache, some awaken your steadiness, some awaken your fear of disappearing, some awaken your hidden tenderness, some awaken your instinct to perform wisdom to rescue, to merge, to withdraw, to prove, to endure. The relationship becomes more legible when you notice not just the emotion, but the emotional identity it recruits. That perspective alone changes the meaning of attraction because attraction stops being only about desire and starts revealing itself as resonance, activation, and unfinished internal arrangement. This matters because many people build their self understanding from relationships that touch them deeply without ever asking whether those relationships reveal truth or simply revealed a deep signature in motion. There is a real difference. A relationship may show you your capacity for devotion, but that does not mean the relationship itself was built to hold your whole life. Another bond may awaken grief, but that does not mean grief is the core truth of the connection. Emotional identity can make a bond feel absolute because it lights up something ancient. An ancient feeling often arrives with a force that the mind mistakes for final meaning. Clarity grows when a person learns to separate the depth of activation from the accuracy of interpretation. You may notice something subtle once that distinction begins settling in. The emotional identities that most strongly shape you are not only the ones that hurt you or complete you, they are also the ones that define what you believe love is allowed to feel like. A person whose signature carries devotion may mistake effort for love because devotion has always felt truest when it costs something. A person whose signature carries vigilance may mistrust ease because calm has often preceded danger. A person whose signature carries invisibility may feel most attached where they are almost seen because almost seen is the emotional climate their identity knows how to survive inside. In this way, emotional identity does not merely influence relationships, it quietly establishes what kinds of love feel believable. That is why growth in this area can feel strangely disorienting, even when it is healthy. The person is not only changing habits, they are changing what emotional climates feel real enough to remain inside. A person who once felt most alive in bonds organized around yearning may begin feeling that same field as depletion. Another who once trusted only those who needed them may begin experiencing that need as pressure rather than intimacy. The love may feel strong, but the emotional identity has started refining what it can call true. When this shift happens, many people feel guilt before relief because the old emotional arrangement had become intertwined with their idea of loyalty, goodness, maturity, or spiritual purpose. This is where the teaching widens beyond relationship and begins touching incarnation more directly. If emotional identities persist across lives, then many of the strongest patterns a person carries are not just reactions to isolated events. They are ways the soul has repeatedly moved through experience until those movements became signature. Some of those signatures may have begun in trauma. Some may have begun in devotion, service, sacrifice, separation, or unfinished vows. Over time, the emotional identity becomes so familiar that the current life treats it as natural. But what feels natural may be continuity, not inevitability. That distinction matters because continuity can be refined, while inevitability tends to be obeyed. You can see the mechanism in simple human terms. If a soul repeatedly learns to organize itself around holding others together, then a future life may carry that emotional signature before any obvious reason appears. The person becomes dependable quickly, reads emotional disorder instinctively, and feels both burdened and coherent when needed. The current life may reward this pattern and call it character, but beneath character, there may be a much older emotional identity that has not yet asked whether its steadiness still serves truth or merely repetition. What looks admirable on the surface may still contain an ancient arrangement waiting to evolve. The same is true for identities organized around grief, exile, hunger, spiritual longing, or protective tenderness. The tone persists because it has become one of the soul's most practiced ways of being real. Yet every emotional identity eventually faces a pressure point where its old form can no longer carry its deeper purpose. Grief must become reverence or it will harden into self definition. Longing must become devotion or it will keep recruiting absence as proof of depth. Vigilance must become discernment or it will mistake narrowed life for safety. The signature is not the problem. The question is whether the current form of it still reveals truth or has started defending familiarity. This is why emotional identity and spiritual path cannot really be separated for long. The path a person chooses is often the visible expression of what their emotional signature has been trying to become. Some people are pulled toward memory work because their inner life is organized around unfinished feeling that wants truth more than comfort. Some are pulled towards service because their deepest emotional tone has always leaned toward responsibility, though that responsibility may need to be cleansed of self erasure. Some are pulled towards solitude because their identity needs enough quiet to hear what belongs to them and what has only been inherited through emotional contact. In each case, the outer path is often shaped by an inner tone that has been moving much longer than the present story can explain. Once this becomes visible, a person begins understanding why certain teachings land with unusual force. They are not merely informative, they resonate with the deeper emotional identity already active in the soul. One person hears a truth about remembrance and breaks open immediately because their entire emotional structure has been built around the pain of partial forgetting. Another hears a truth about embodied trust and feels almost nothing because that tone has not yet become central in their path. The mismatch is not failure. It shows that recognition is emotional before it becomes conceptual. This is also why real teaching does not only give information, it reaches the part of a person that already knows how to tremble when something true has touched its signature layer. That trembling is important because it reveals the difference between emotional identity being seen and emotional identity being indulged. When the identity is truly seen, there is both recognition and widening. The person feels known, but they do not feel trapped. When the identity is indulged, there is recognition without widening. The person feels intensely validated, but nothing new becomes possible. This is a useful test in all spiritual and emotional work. Does the naming of the deeper pattern create more honest movement, or only more refined attachment to the self story built around it? A true seeing opens the field. A flattering seeing usually narrows it. You may also notice that some emotional identities are collective as much as personal. Families, communities, lineages, and cultures can all organize around recurring emotional tones that become invisible through repetition. One family may build its whole atmosphere around restraint and call that strength. Another may build itself around chronic crisis and call that closeness. A community may build its tone around idealism, martyrdom, suspicion, guilt, or aspirations. Individuals born into these climates do not only inherit beliefs, they inherit emotional conditions that can fuse with their own deeper signatures in ways that feel intensely personal. This is one reason some people take decades to discover which emotional patterns are theirs by soul and which were strengthened by the field they entered. That distinction can never be made through thinking alone. It has to be lived, noticed, and tested. A person begins separating inherited atmosphere from deeper signature by observing what remains once external conditioning weakens. After enough distance, enough truth, enough contact, certain emotional patterns fade because they were sustained by the surrounding field. Others remain because they belong to a deeper continuity. This process requires patience because the inherited and the essential often arrive braided together. Many people judge themselves too quickly here. They think whatever remains longest must be the truest part of them, when sometimes what remains longest is simply what has been rehearsed the most. The more patiently a person studies this, the more a new form of emotional maturity begins taking shape. Maturity is no longer just regulation or composure. It becomes the ability to feel deeply without immediately making each feeling into identity, instruction, or destiny. It becomes the ability to ask what in me has been activated, what in me is ancient, what in me is conditioned, and what in me is trying to evolve its form. That kind of maturity is slower than most people want. It does not offer instant certainty, but it creates something more valuable than certainty. It creates emotional accuracy, and emotional accuracy changes the whole spiritual life. Once accuracy deepens, even your past begins to rearrange itself. You stop seeing your life as a random collection of reactions and start seeing the continuity of the soul learning its own emotional language. The bonds that broke you, the teachings that steadied you, the phases that felt empty, the seasons that felt unreasonably intense, all begin revealing how your emotional identity has been trying to move from distortion into clearer form. Nothing becomes smaller under that view. If anything, the life becomes more meaningful because its emotional patterns no longer look accidental. They begin looking like unfinished intelligence searching for a truer way to live. And when you finally start seeing your emotional identity this way, another layer of the path quietly comes into view. The question is no longer only what your emotional signature is. The question becomes what kind of world, what kind of relationships, and what kind of spiritual structure will be needed for that signature to stop surviving and finally begin speaking in its cleanest voice.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.